Okay, I had to push record again. It is the top of the hour. We want to thank you all for attending our third series for the month of July. And this will be our last one until August, okay? So we want to thank Kyle for doing 2 of these for us. We really appreciate you. And we again want to thank all of you for coming and out on these Wednesdays and being a part of this, asking your questions.
I didn't realize it.
Last week, my Zoom went out and I thought that everything in the chat was still captured because when it came back on, I was able to see everything. Unfortunately, it erased all of your names. So that is why if you did not receive a certificate or did not see your name in that certificate folder, please let me know so I can make sure you receive it. But that is what happened. And so therefore today I'm asking again for you to put your information in, but I would say let's about 5 minutes before we all get off, I am going to make sure that I re-ask you to put it back in again, just in case Zoom kicks me out again, because it looks like it wants to start storming outside my window here in Rocky Mount. So just want to put that out there, okay? And also today, we're going to have 2 people to talk to us today. We get Caroline Hunley, and she is going to grace us today with some information that a lot of you have been asking about, which is cool that you've been asking. It's about the tool, utilizing the tool to help you order food. And so she will start us out today, and then we will flow right into Kyle. We are recording, so I'll make sure that you receive this. If you talk to somebody else who has been trying to utilize that tool that Caroline is going to talk about, please make sure you let them know that we do have it recorded so that they can catch up and that they can utilize it as well. So without further ado, Caroline, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sharonda. I'm thrilled to be here. Hey, everybody. So the tool that Sharonda is referring to is the local food purchasing calculator. And so basically, this is for any childcare provider that wants to calculate how much local food to purchase based on the number of children that you're serving. So it can sometimes be challenging to know how many pounds of, let's say, cucumbers you need to purchase, especially like if it's an online form. It's like, okay, I have all these children in my classroom. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know that, right? Like, how many cucumbers do I really need? And the farmer doesn't care how many children I have. He just wants to know how many pounds of cucumbers to deliver, right? So several years ago, with the Child and Adult Care Food Program, we created this calculator. So that's the tool that I'm going to spend some time going over today. It is very, very simple, so this will not take long at all, but I just, A, want to make sure that you know that this tool is here, and B, that you know how to use it properly. So first of all, I put in the chat the link to our website, so that way you can know how to find the tool in the future and not just give you a link to the tool. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully, let's see. Screen 2. Please let me know how that looks with a thumbs up. This is our homepage. Can you guys see that? Oh, you're the only person
Yes,
I can see.
ma'am.
There's a thumbs up. Okay, thank you. All right, that's a lot of thumbs up. Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate that. So I'm going to scroll all the way down to where the local food purchasing calculator lives. It's this NC Fresh Produce Purchasing and Prep Guide. So I'm going to click on this. And what you'll see here is that once I click on it, this is basically an overview of what this tool does and why it's here. It does have instructions for how to complete it, but you hopefully will not need that after today. Then what's really important is that you first click on which age group that you are working with. So as I mentioned, I worked with Child and Adult Care Food Program to put this together. And so it is based on the serving suggestions or the serving size requirements that CACFP has for children. So as you know, those are based on 2 things. They're based on the age of the child, but they're also based on the actual meal that we're talking about. So it's really important that you have that information. So I'm going to say that I'm working with an infant toddler teacher, and we are going to order cucumbers for a snack. Okay. Let's see. So let's see. What did I actually already download? I changed my mind. Let's say that we are working with 3 to 5-year-olds. I'm going to pull up this one that I've already downloaded. Because like Sharonda, I'm in the country and it takes me a really long time to download things. So let's go with what I've already pulled up here. Can you guys see the Excel spreadsheet that I'm looking at? And is it super tiny or is it, okay, cool, thanks, Kyle. So basically, this is a list of some common items that you might see for breakfast. There's breakfast down here. There's lunch and supper, which has different items. And then there's snack. So remember we said we need to first look at which age group we're looking at, and then we need to next make sure we know which meal or snack we're looking at. So that determines, again, the quantity of produce. So I just want to briefly say that this is based on CACFP serving size suggestions. So typically providers have rounded up because their children eat more than what CACFP tells us they will eat. So I'm just going to put that in there. You guys, once you start working with it, will realize how it works for your folks, but I'm just going to give you the overview of how it works, and then you guys can kind of adjust it based on your need. So let's say we want to start working with a farmer and we want to order blueberries for our children for breakfast. So we have 20 3 to 5-year-olds in our center, and we want to order blueberries for breakfast, right? So again, I have the age of the children and I have the meal as breakfast. So I've pulled up this spreadsheet. It says 3 to 5 up here. And I've clicked on breakfast down here at the bottom. And I want to order blueberries. So all I do, literally the only thing you have to type in is your number of children. So I'm going to type in over here where it says servings. I'm going to type in 20 because that's how many children I'm expecting. I'm going to hit enter, and then voila, 3.5 pounds is how many blueberries. Sharonda, Kyle, I mean, how cool is that, right, guys? It's like so easy. You just put in the number, out comes the poundage. So this should be the same for each. So if you want to just go ahead and put 20 all the way down, you can see you might get some good inspo for what breakfast you want to have next week. If you want to do peaches, that has that here. So again, all you have to do is count your number of children. For 3 to 5-year-olds, you're going to put that here. Okay, you're going to type it in here and it's going to output the number of pounds. So if you have 1 to 2-year-olds, you can come back to your, oh, is my screen doing something weird? Or can you see it? Okay, so again, we have the same thing for 1 to 2-year-olds. You'll need to know your age group and how many children. And then we have this 3 to 5-year-olds, which we just did. We also have school-age children, which is helpful for snack too. So again, these are the different resources. You would just put in your number of children for each of the workbook, add them all together, and then you would have what you need to order. Do we have any questions? Love to know what you think.
I don't see anything in the chat. Please
Okay.
unmute yourselves and ask any questions that you have at this time.
It is pretty simple, but I am here. If you guys have any questions, or maybe you see a menu item that's not on there that you think would be helpful, please let us know. We are here to kind of adapt this to make sure that it's useful for you guys. But that's all for me. I'm looking forward to hearing from Kyle next.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Okay, so we're talking about composting and watering today. And I finally took the slide with my picture out of here. I think I've talked to you all 6 times now, so hopefully you know who I am by now. But I want to start off with talking about watering because this might seem like a really simple topic, but it's actually incredibly important. And watering the incorrect way or not understanding why you're watering or how to water can really mess up your garden. And it's not something we usually put too much thought in. Uh, this summer we've had intense periods of drought, and right now, at least where I live, we're getting rain almost every day. So we've had really intense drought and rain periods this summer. So maybe it's been more on your mind, but just some general gardening rules around watering is that most of the plants in your garden will need about 1 inch of water per week. So that's not actually a whole lot. And a lot of gardeners that are just starting out or don't really think about watering too much have a tendency to overwater their plants. And this can be bad for a lot of different reasons. We'll kind of dive into some issues with overwatering, but you're better off watering less often and watering very deeply. So maybe you water 2 times a week. If it didn't rain that week, maybe you water 2 times that week. And you want to water very deeply. So that means 5 to 6 inches into the soil. And that way I'm telling my plants, send roots down into the soil to find water. So I'm sort of forcing my plants to grow large root systems, which will make healthier plants over the long haul. So weather is really important. We talked about that 1 inch rule for plants. Plants need about 1 inch of rainfall, but or 1 inch of water a week, but that includes rainfall, right? So let's say it rained 3 or 4 days this week. I don't need to water my garden this week. And a really easy way to keep up with this without having to check the weather every day or check the average rainfall in your area is to get a rain gauge. And rain gauges are really simple. Usually they're telling you up to maybe 6 inches of rain, and children in your sites can read them for you. So they're helping you and your teachers and the children all sort of be in tune with the weather, how much water my garden is getting every week. So I'm not overwatering or underwatering. I think I'm lagging a little bit. Is my audio okay, Caroline and Sharonda?
Yes, you sound fine to me.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
same here.
Okay, cool. So there are some exceptions to that 1 inch rule, the 1 inch of water every week rule. And these are going to be in the form of your most vulnerable plants in the garden. So the classic example of a vulnerable plant is a plant that I just transplanted. Maybe I went and bought a bunch of corn from my local gardening store. It's already started, and I transplanted my corn into my garden. For the first few weeks after I transplant that plant, it's going to be very vulnerable to drought. It's going to need extra water. When you transplant the plant, you usually water it very heavily immediately. But I would monitor that plant more than my other plants for the next 1 to 2 weeks until it gets acclimated, because the act of transplanting is one of the most stressful events in a plant's life. And that sort of same rule applies to new sprouts. So maybe I just planted a big patch of dill. As soon as those dill sprout, their root systems are incredibly small. And that means they can only get water from a very limited area, at least for a little bit until they've expanded their root zones. And so my very newly sprouted plants also need extra care and extra just attention those first few weeks of their life. But most of my established plants, that 1 inch of water a week rule is more than adequate. these are just two of the most obvious examples of exceptions to that rule. This is probably the most overlooked area of watering for like a new gardener or for kids that are gardening. So if I tell my 3-year-old in my class to go water my tomatoes, the human inclination is to take my watering can and just do just like this picture shows. I just want to pour the water right on top of the plant. Flowers, leaves, tomatoes, all of it. I'm just soaking that plant in water. That's the human inclination. But this gets us into trouble in the garden. And so when you're teaching the kids at your centers how to garden and how to water, definitely take the time to show them where to water your plants. And you want to water plants at the base of their plant. So I want to go underneath all that foliage, all those flowers, all the fruit. I want to go underneath to the base of that plant and water the root zone. And essentially the root zone is an area right around, almost a circle around my plant, a pretty small circle of where I think the roots would be. And if I just watered right at the base where those stems are sort of meeting the roots, that's fine. What you don't want to do is soak your plant, because there's some consequences that we'll talk about here in a minute about why that could be dangerous, why that could help harbor diseases and spread diseases. So we want to avoid soaking my leaves and my flowers and my stems. And we also want to avoid splashing soil onto the plant. And so that's why, like, a watering can that has like a similar drip to that's gentle. If I put that water onto soil, it's probably not going to splash. But if I use like a jet setting on a garden hose, that's going to splash soil everywhere. It's going to get soil all over my plants. And there's a lot of reasons why we don't want that. And we'll kind of dive into that here in a second. So when to water. This seems also simple, but it's important. You want to water earlier in the day if you can. And the thing to remember is that it's definitely better to water whenever you can than to not water at all. So this is more of a suggestion. If you can only water at night, go for it. But if you're going to be at your center in the morning outside, that's the best time to water earlier in the morning, because my plants are already wet from dew. And if I'm trying to minimize the amount of time my leaves and my stems are staying wet, if I go ahead and water the plants in the morning when they're already wet from dew, I'm minimizing that amount of time that they're staying wet. And then again, some diseases, especially fungal diseases that we'll talk about more in a minute, they can be spread by prolonged states of moisture in a plant. So if my plants are getting, wet and dewy at nighttime, and that lasts until maybe 8 or 9 a.m. when they're getting direct sun, and then I just go soak them again at noon, that's really extending the amount of time that those plants stay wet and stay in a state where they could be spreading diseases. And again, water 5 to 6 inches deep. And this is a fun activity to do with your class. You could take a ruler or something and dig a little trench 5 or 6 inches into the ground right near a plant, and then just kind of water that area to see how much water or how long maybe it takes until you can actually feel the water 6 inches down. And that's kind of what you're looking for. And then you can use that same sort of activity to tell you when to water. So if the first 2 inches of soil are bone dry, then it's definitely time to go ahead and water again. That's also easy. Get a ruler, get some 3 and 4-year-olds, whatever age group, and they could sort of put their fingers in 2 inches of soil and tell you, what does it feel like? Is it wet? Is it bone dry? those are good indications of how much you should water and when you need to water. So I talked about some reasons we don't want to keep our plants wet. And this is the main reason we don't want to keep plants wet all day. And it's fungal diseases. And there's a lot of different kinds. I'll kind of showcase two common ones in the garden in the next slide. But fungal diseases usually live in the soil. And so just naturally, it's pretty easy to spread things from the soil to a plant I'm growing in the soil, obviously. And that's why we don't want to splash soil onto the plants when we can avoid it. Obviously, it's going to happen sometimes, but we want to try to keep the soil away from the leaves to keep these sort of fungal diseases off my plants. But just naturally, this is going to happen. And what happens is these fungal spores end up on my leaves, on my stems, and they're kind of like little seeds that germinate when they get wet for a long time. Usually a long time means 9 hours. So if my leaf is soaking wet for 9 hours in a row and it has one of these fungal spores on it, it's likely to sort of start this disease. And again, if I'm watering at 10 or 11 o'clock, that plant's already been wet all night, and now I'm making it wet for the next 6 hours, I'm really opening it up to these fungal diseases. So we want to keep our plants dry when we can. And, nature's going to make this impossible sometimes. At my house this week, my plants have just been wet all week. And so a week like this, where it's raining every day, these classic fungal diseases, this is when you will see them. These are two that are just really common in the garden. Powdery mildew is, I would say, probably the most known fungal disease that you've probably seen in your gardens or your parents' gardens or your grandparents' gardens. And a week like this, where I live, if it's wet all week, there's a good chance that powdery mildew might be starting in my garden. And this is kind of what it looks like. It looks like almost like frosted flakes. My squash leaves have turned into frosted flakes. And we can talk about how to get rid of that later, but this is just kind of an example of why I need to keep my leaves dry when I can. Root rot is another fungal disease. These fungal spores actually create a disease that rots out the roots of my beans. And obviously, both of these will kill the plant after a while. So more of just cautionary tales of why these diseases are important to think about, why watering habits are important to think about. Again, not something we think about too often in gardening about, when should I water? But they do matter and they can help stop these fungal diseases. And there's lots more fungal diseases. I just kind of highlighted two that you might have seen. And this time of year, we're growing squash and beans. So these are very realistic right now. So if I'm not paying attention to maybe the weather or my watering schedule, it's really easy to overwater my plants. And if I'm overwatering them too much, like to an extreme, that's just as severe as a really bad drought. So maybe I water my plant deeply every single day for a week or two. That might have the same effects as if it got no water for that same amount of time. And the signs and symptoms are going to be different. So a very classic sign that my plants are getting overwatered is the very most bottom leaves are turning yellow. So that would mean the lowest leaves on the stem, the leaves closest to the ground are turning yellow, and it maybe slowly creeps its way up my stem until I've resolved that issue. That's a really classic sign of overwatering. Another sign is necrosis of the leaves. So that just means some classic black or brown spots that you can't figure out maybe why they're there. That's just a sign that potentially this plant has been overwatered for too long. And, you know, if I'm getting heavy rain all week, I'm not thinking about it, so I'm watering on top of that, then my soil is staying clogged with water. And that means air cannot get into my soil, air cannot get to my roots, and I'm cutting off oxygen to my plants' roots. And after a while, that will kill the roots of my plants. Um, and if the soil drains, my plants will likely recover, but they won't quite be as vigorous because I lost part of my root system. So these are some sort of cautionary reasons why we should be careful about overwatering, and maybe some signs that either nature or myself are overwatering my garden. So mulch is beneficial to your garden for a lot of different reasons. And I'll sort of brush on some of the general reasons. But mulch helps with watering too. And so some other benefits to mulching is it suppresses weeds. So it's very difficult for a weed seed to penetrate a few inches of a good mulch. So it's making the weed less. It also helps with pest control because now, you know, pests aren't being able to feed on those weeds, things like that. Those are just two general reasons why I want to mulch. But in the sense of watering my garden, mulch is almost protecting the water that my plants get. So it's insulating my plants. So when I do water them, it lasts longer. The soil's not drying out as fast. Also, let's say I use this exact sort of wood mulch I see in this picture. I put 2 inches over my whole garden. When I do water my garden now, it's very unlikely that soil is going to splash onto my plants, which we talked about earlier, that might cause that fungal disease. So this is a fun activity to do if I'm going to mulch my garden for part of my garden lesson. I could take maybe 2 corn plants and I could mulch one and leave the other one without any mulch and water them and just see what happens to the soil. And usually what will happen is the plant that's mulched, when I'm watering it, the soil is not going to move at all. That 2-inch layer of mulch is heavy. It's just going to stay in the exact same place. So soil's not going to splash up. It's going to keep my soil in the same place and protect my soil. And then my corn plant that has no mulch, when I water it, you will see the soil be displaced even a little bit. And it just kind of shows you some of the benefits of mulching. It's a really easy activity you can do with your class. My soil type is going to impact how much I need to water as well. So I said most plants need about 1 inch of water a week in whatever form nature or you are going to give it to it. But my soil type can change that math. And we're not going to get super specific about how the math changes, but I will kind of brush on each soil type and how it might change that math. So where I live, I have heavy clay soil. And clay is made of really small particles. And so it holds on to water because each of those particles are getting wet and they're all holding on to that water really, really firmly. So clay does not have, clay retains water very well. which can be good and can be bad. It's really bad if it rains every day that week, because now that soil is getting clogged with water, it's cutting off oxygen to my roots. So clay needs the least amount of water because it holds on to water the best. Sandy soil is the exact opposite. Sandy soil has the biggest particles. So it has the least amount of surface area, and water passes through it very easily. Nutrients also pass through it very easily. So sandy soil needs more water and more fertilizer. And that could be organic fertilizer, compost. And then clay, on the other hand, needs the least amount of fertilizer. It holds on to nutrients very well. It doesn't leach nutrients. And then silt and loam soil are somewhere in between, probably closer to that 1 inch a week. They act more naturally in terms of what we're talking about. So if you know you have clay, if you know you have sand, you might just want to think about how that's impacting my watering. Again, if that sort of feeling the top 2 inches of my soil test to see how wet or dry it is, that can kind of help you understand how your soil is handling water. So irrigation is going to help with some of these issues in terms of it just makes it a lot easier for you. If I have a small garden that's 2 or 3 garden beds, you might not even want to irrigate it. It might just be more fun to have, the children at your center water it twice a week. But I did just kind of want to run over the options. And the easiest irrigation system to set up is a sprinkler, because likely you'll need 1 sprinkler for your whole garden space at your center. If I have 4 raised beds, 1 sprinkler is going to easily cover that area. It takes the least amount of setup. It's probably the cheapest irrigation system I could do. Now, the issue with this is that this is doing what we talked about we probably shouldn't be doing when we water. It's watering the whole plant from top to bottom, soaking my whole tomato plant, my whole squash plant. So that's not great. If I timed it right, maybe, really early in the morning, it would probably be okay because those plants are probably already wet from dew. But again, this is a very easy way to water my garden, cheap. It just doesn't water maybe in the perfect way we'd hope to water our garden, which can be totally fine. Drip irrigation is more what we're looking for in terms of how the watering is happening. So drip irrigation is essentially these tubes that are connected to a hose. They have very small holes in them, and those holes should line up with the root zone of my plant. So I turn my drip irrigation system on, and a very small amount of water is being deposited right at the root zone of my plant for an extended period of time. So this is kind of doing everything we wanted to do. It's watering the exact spot to save on water. So it's watering the root zone and only the root zone. It's not splashing dirt anywhere because it's watering at such a slow rate. It's almost just dripping water, drip irrigation. And so this is kind of the ideal way to water if we want any sort of irrigation. If we don't want to do it by hand, this is the more ideal way. It is somewhat hard to set up. There's lots of different kinds. It can be overwhelming. And then, these look like some pepper plants in this picture. And this drip irrigation system might be set up just for the root zones of pepper plants. But maybe if I'm having a fall crop that's kale or something else, it might not line up perfectly with the next crop's root zone. So it gets a little complicated. But if you did really want some irrigation, this is probably the way to go. It just takes some more thought and some more planning out. But definitely, it's not hard to do if you put your mind to it. Okay, so let's talk about compost now. Compost could be a very long lesson by itself. I didn't want this to feel like you're in biology class, so I tried to simplify it. in a short amount of time. But if you have more questions about compost afterwards, feel free to email me. You could call me. We could talk about it in more detail about maybe how to set something up at your center. But this is kind of a general overview just to get you used to the idea and kind of understanding some of the basic principles of composting. And the first question is just, what is compost? And there's a lot of ways to describe it, but really all we're doing is we're decomposing organic matter into a soil-like substance. So most gardeners call it black gold. Compost has a lot of great properties for our garden that we'll talk about in a minute. But really all we're doing is the same thing nature does. So we're taking leaves and food scraps and all these organic materials, and we're just breaking them down into their base components. So now my plants in my garden can access those nutrients. Because if I just throw my banana peel into my garden, it might have all the potassium in the world, but my root system can't access that potassium until it's broken down by nature. And composting is doing just that. So what's the importance of compost? To me, the most important thing about compost from sort of a food waste perspective is that any organic matter that we're, eating, any vegetable food scraps or fruit scraps can be decomposed by compost, and they shouldn't be going to landfills when they can make great compost for our gardens. So just from a food waste perspective, composting is a great endeavor. And then what it actually does for our garden is a lot of different things. I've grossly simplified what it does, but essentially compost greatly improves the soil structure in our garden. So all that organic matter is basically a great soil amendment. So if I'm adding it to something like clay or sand, it's improving the soil, helping with water retention, helping aerate my soil. All those great things about soil building, compost is doing in spades. And then compost is adding nutrients to my soil. There are lots of organic gardeners that never put any sort of fertilizer on their gardens. They just use compost. I'm not recommending that, but that's definitely something you could do. If you have enough compost, that means you're adding a lot of nutrition to your garden that plants will be able to access very easily. So compost is a great soil amendment. It's good for my soil structure, and it's also sort of helping the environment because, again, nothing that's compostable, no really organic matter needs to be going to a landfill. We already send plenty of stuff to a landfill. Why not make it into compost instead? So then that leads us to the question of what we can compost. And these two lists of what I can't compost and what I can compost, this is specifically meant for a backyard compost pile. There are very fancy compost systems that use machinery that can kind of break these rules. This is just for your backyard, maybe a compost pile at your center or at your house. So what we do want to be composting is fruit and vegetable scraps. So really any fruit and vegetable scrap is fine as long as it's not cooked with oil or something like that. So really raw fruit and vegetable scraps is what we want to be doing. But if I steam some broccoli and didn't put any oil on it, that would be fine to compost as well. But we want to avoid cooking oils in our compost. So fresh fruit and vegetable scraps, really any organic matter that you're finding outside. So maybe that's grass clippings, leaves, smaller twigs. we don't want to be adding huge sticks to our compost because it's going to be hard to decompose that in any fast amount of time. Eggshells are great to compost, coffee grounds. You can put paper products in compost. That's very common. I just be a little wary of what chemicals are in that paper, but you can compost paper. It will turn into compost. And then dead plants from my garden. So let's say in a few weeks, I pick maybe 6 heads of corn from my garden. Now I have this big corn stalk. That's a perfect thing to just harvest the corn, cut off my corn stalk at its base, throw it in my compost pile. So really any of those dead plants from my garden or in my yard are great to put in compost, with some exceptions on the do not compost list. So we're not composting meat. We're not composting dairy or oil. And then these are the two that are extremely important. No disease plants. So let's say my tomatoes got blight this year, or maybe my potatoes got blight. I'm I'm just gonna find an area of woods or something and throw it way away. I don't want those disease plants anywhere near my garden or my compost pile because plenty of plant diseases are going to live in that compost. And when I put it back into my garden, it'll just stay.
Kyle, if
Yeah.
I can real quick, because you were talking about that, we had a question about black spots on tomatoes on the vines and what causes that, if that relates to what you're talking about at the moment.
Yeah. Black spots could be blight. I'd have to see a picture because there's more than one thing that could cause that, but I mean it could be that could be blight. If you what if it's happening right now, please send me a picture and I could give a better answer. Because it's not one thing. But I'm gonna share my email at the end of this, and if you'd like to send me a picture, I'd be more than happy to help you figure it out. But those are not. I would not compost those tomatoes, for example, especially if I don't know what the disease is. And then seeds for weed plants. So I said I should compost grass clippings. They're a great source of nitrogen in my compost pile. If those grass plants have gone to seed and have seeds in them, I do not want them in my compost pile. Because one of the benefits to compost is I'm adding something that's weed free. Weeds are obviously very annoying in my garden. The last thing I want to do is lace my compost pile with weeds. And when I put it on my garden, now I just have a big patch of grass I have to deal with. That's not the reason we're composting. So try to keep weed seeds out of your compost. So when you hear about composting, you'll often hear about greens and browns, and how much greens or how much brown should I put in my compost pile. And this is kind of what they're talking about. And greens are those materials that are really high in nitrogen. And these are usually plants that have just been growing. So most of my vegetable scraps will be considered greens. Grass clippings are a really obvious example of greens. Leaves of plants are greens when they're when they've just come off the plant. Browns are going to be high in carbon. So dead leaves, when fall comes, all those leaves fall off. Those big piles of leaves in your yards, those are browns from my compost pile. And then paper, sticks, those are other examples of browns. Straw is a good example of browns, things like that. So those are just telling me, is this material high in nitrogen if it's green or high in carbon if it's brown? And most compost recipes are going to ask you to put a certain amount of greens and browns in there. And we'll kind of talk about what a recipe looks like as well. Okay, so there's two types of compost. And they both follow similar rules about everything we've talked about up until right now. Hot compost piles take a lot more effort and work, but they make compost in a short amount of time. So we're talking maybe 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes, less than a few months. I could go from a big compost pile to compost that's ready to go into my garden if I'm doing hot composting. And hot composting is a few characteristics. One is that it needs to be a certain size. So my compost pile needs to be a certain size. And that size, at a minimum, it needs to be 3 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. So I need at least that much organic material just to start a hot compost pile. If I don't have that much, I should be doing the other type of composting, which is cold composting, which we'll talk about in a few slides. But with hot composting, I need that initial material because otherwise I'm kind of missing the ingredients for my recipe. And with a compost pile, you don't really need a container. If you want one, I think they probably look better. It makes it a little easier. In this picture, you see someone just has just almost like a square with an open face made of wood. That square is probably 3 or 4 feet high, which I think is about right because that kind of tells me how tall it is. Usually I try to make mine about 4 feet high, just so I can kind of get a really easy mental picture of, okay, I have 3 feet of material now. But the reason I need that much material for a hot compost pile is because the core temperature of my hot compost pile is going to reach 110 to 140 degrees. And if I don't have that much mass, I can't really reach that internal temperature of 110 to 140 degrees because that tells me I have a hot compost pile. And so the best thing to do if I really want a hot compost pile is to buy one of those big thermometers like you'd use if you're grilling, stick it down to your compost pile and see what the internal temperature is. And again, it's going to be really high. Even after 5 days, it'll probably be 110 at least. And so if it is 110 to 140, I know my compost is doing what it should be doing. And the reason it gets so hot in the inside is because I have aerobic bacteria that are decomposing all that organic matter in the compost. And the active decomposition from those bacteria creates heat. So again, this composting style, hot compost, is harder to execute. You need it to be closer to perfect to achieve the end result, but it's faster. It is really fun to show a group of kids, inside this compost pile, it's twice as hot as it is outside. You can put the temperature gauge in there with them. So here's what a recipe for a hot compost pile would look like. So you're talking, it needs to be wet, not soaking wet, but it needs to be sort of saturated with water throughout. You also want a shovel of natural soil or native soil. Maybe it's from your garden, maybe it's from 2 feet away from the compost pile, but just, a few cups of native soil in that mix. And then we get to the actual bulk of the ingredients, which is 2 to 3 parts of the brown, so carbon. So leaves are probably the easiest one to get. They're usually free. Sometimes your city will just drop leaves off for you for free if you ask for them, or they collect leaves in a certain area. You can go pick them up. And in my yard, I have plenty of leaves for my compost pile every year. And then 1 part nitrogen. So that's the greens. So a really easy way to think about this is I'm going to add, let's say, 2 cups of leaves for every 1 cup of grass clippings. And that's sort of the base recipe. But again, I need enough material to go 3 feet high, 3 feet long, and 3 feet wide, which is a pretty large amount of these materials to make a hot compost pile. And then sort of the last characteristic of a hot compost pile is that I'm turning it every once in a while to sort of keep that process going, because all those materials on the inside that are at 110 to 140 degrees, they're decomposing quickly. And at a certain point, those organisms are running out of things to decompose. The temperature drops. That's when you want to sort of turn the pile, get everything on the outside back on the inside. And after 3 to 4 weeks of doing this process, if everything is going right, you will have compost ready for your garden. And if I'm checking the temperature, I can see, okay, it's gone below 110. It's time to turn my pile. And then eventually your pile will just be black or brown and look very similar to dirt. And then you know it's ready to go in your garden. So hot composting is a lot more complicated than cold composting. And if I were any of you at your centers and wanted a much easier composting system, I would do cold composting. This is what I do at my house. So let's talk about cold composting and what that looks like. So cold compost has all the same principles of hot compost, except it's not getting hot on the inside. And I don't care as much about the ratio of things going in it. So the recipe is really whatever I have on hand. It's a bunch of leaves and whatever vegetable scraps from my kitchen or my childcare center. Throw it all into a pile, and then maybe every time I cook a meal, I'll just go throw those extra vegetable scraps in there. I did some yard work. Now I'm just going to throw some grass clippings in there. It's much more whatever you have on hand. And I don't need that initial 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet of organic material. I can start with whatever I have. The downside to this is it takes a lot longer. So it's taking 3 to 6 months to decompose because those aerobic microorganisms are not helping the process. They're the ones that speed things up. So it's much slower. You're going to get a very similar result of really good compost that can go into your garden, but it's much easier. You don't really need to flip it maybe more than once. So, and really by flipping it, it's just sort of turning it around, getting all those parts on the outside to the inside. Usually I flip my cold compost 1 time in 6 months. So very low input. I'm just sort of putting whatever organic matter I have from my kitchen, from my yard, from my garden, from my leaves, all into a pile. And at a certain point, maybe when it's 3 feet tall, you get to pick. You just stop putting anything in that pile so that whole pile can decompose. And maybe I'll start a new pile beside it. Because if I just keep adding vegetable scraps every day, I'll never get a finished product, right? But maybe I get it 2 feet high, say I'm done with this pile, I'll let it sit for 3 or 6 months, and then I'll have compost. So again, cold compost is much easier, less effort. The recipe does not need to be perfect. It just takes a lot longer, which is usually fine in a garden setting. Most things take time in the garden. This is no exception. So again, I kind of just covered the most simple basis of composting. And here's just a few general tips when you're sort of starting your pile. I would have a dedicated compost bucket or something like that, that maybe I keep right outside the door. So I'm not having to make trips to my compost pile every time I have snack time or every time I have lunch. You could just take those fruit and vegetable scraps, put them in that bucket. And when my bucket's full, now I'm taking my full bucket to the compost pile. That's a very simple thing, but just saves you time, makes composting easier. The contents of the bucket will be pretty nasty, but that's part of composting. And let's say I'm adding that bucket of organic matter to my compost pile once a week. I do want to be covering those fruit and vegetable scraps with maybe leaves. I keep a really large leaf pile right beside my compost, and then I just sort of cover my fruit and vegetable scraps with leaves every time, because both of those things have been composted, but now I'm sort of muffling that smell so I'm not attracting animals to my compost pile, because raccoons and mice and all types of animals like compost piles. So if I'm covering it with leaves, that's hopefully keeping them out or keeping them less interested, which is why I'm not putting my compost pile right beside my childcare center and right beside my garden. It should be hopefully on maybe the border, maybe beside some woods, a little bit away from things. Because even if I do it perfectly, I might attract a field mice here and there or a raccoon here and there. And I want to keep them away from my garden, away from my center. So those are just some basic composting tips. Again, composting is incredibly complicated. I tried to break it down to its most simple components, but cold composting is definitely the way to go if you just want a more passive composting system. And again, I'm going to share my email after this. So if you have specific questions about your site or how you should get started, you can call me or email me. I'd be happy to answer those questions.
Kyle, I have two questions for you.
Okay.
One was, will compost attract animals?
Yeah, so definitely, but if I'm being really conscious about, hey, I'm putting my banana scraps in, I'm sort of burying it, putting leaves on top, that's going to reduce the amount of animals by tenfold. So in my compost pile, I have basically a circle of metal wire, and I put my compost in the middle, and then I bury my scraps with leaves. Um, I've not had a larger animal than a field mice come to my compost pile with that system. So if I'm just throwing food scraps on top, yeah, you're gonna attract anything that has a nose that likes rotting things. But if I'm burying them, even just throwing leaves on top, covering them up, you should avoid most of those problems, especially in a city where, I live in the country where there's tons of raccoons and things, and they don't even smell it. So yes and no, there are definitely ways to combat.
Thank you. And the next question was, using BT for squash vine borer and or for severe case of cabbage, white flies slash moths, when to use, time of day, etc.
Okay, I would have to go look at the BT recommendations. I don't know the BT recommendations off the top of my head. BT is definitely what I would pick for especially cabbage worms. Off the top of my head, I could not tell you what the instructions on a BT packet is, but that's exactly what I would follow. I wouldn't deviate from the packet's instructions on BT at all. But that's what I would do for BT. And yeah, I think that's a great product. Where I live, I cannot grow cabbage and kale without dealing with cabbage worms. So that's a totally fine intervention if it's come to that.
Okay. That person also said we can look at the instructions, just wanted to confirm they're applying it later today. That's why they were just asking. And
Yeah,
then we
yeah.
and then we had another one. Does the watering rule still apply to raised beds slash garden containers?
Ooh,
Container
great
gardening.
question. Raised beds function in a similar way. to an in-ground garden, they're a little bit differently. They usually drain water better. So for raised beds, yes, I think 1 inch is about fine. For containers, it's a little bit different. So it depends on the size of my container, what my container is made out of, and that sort of feeling 2 inches down will sort of help you figure it out. But for example, I have on my front porch, I have very large sort of garden fabric bags that function as pots. And I grow a lot of vegetables in them, but they're black and they're 5 gallon containers. So, because they're black, they really soak up sunlight and they get very hot. And all that surface area almost acts as a wick for my water. So they dry out much faster than my raised beds or my in-ground gardens. So I do need to water them more. Because they're 5 gallons though, it's not that much more. But if I have very small pots and small containers, 100%, I'm probably watering them twice as much as my garden, because there's such a small amount of soil. It's almost more surface area than soil sometimes for a small pot. So definitely you'd want to water a small container more than a raised bed or an in-ground garden. Okay, so I only have a few slides left, but I did just want to touch on something that we talked about at one of the first learning bursts that I did, and that's sort of how to plan my garden throughout the year and how to think about my garden in the maximum size of my plant. So I plant 10 tomato plants. I want to be thinking about spacing them out based off how big they are when they're adults, not how big they are now or in a month. And this is actually 2 pictures of my garden. So here's the first picture. I took this picture and shared it with you all in May. I took it right before one of our learning bursts in May. So it's only been 2 months. This is my herb garden. You see on the right of this picture, you see some oregano. On the very far right, you see a strawberry plant. We have a lot of little basil plants that I put in. And this is what this exact space looks like 2 months later, this morning. So clearly, these plants are too close together. But it's a good example of I want to be thinking about the maximum size of my garden bed. And if these were something like tomatoes, we'd have a disaster on our hands because tomatoes carry fungal diseases, or squash, for example, carry fungal diseases very easily. And all my leaves are touching, which means none of my leaves are ever getting dry. With herbs, it's a lot easier because all these herbs, I'm eating the leaves. So I could go take out half these herbs right now, preserve them, cook them fresh. I mean, that's 4 huge basil plants. I could just freeze pesto for the year. But with something like a tomato or a squash, you can't just cut half the plant out because, what, you just killed half your tomato plant, right? So it's easier with an herb garden. This afternoon, I'm going to go harvest a bunch of this stuff, preserve it, cook it this week. But just kind of give you an idea of how our eyes can kind of play tricks on us, because 2 months is not that long in real life, but in a garden season, it's everything because, again, I can see the rocks in my garden. I can see the soil. Fast forward to 2 months later, I can't see anything except a bunch of leaves on my herb plants. But again, in an herb garden, this is an easy fix because I could go dry that oregano for the year. I could dry my basil for the year. Actually, some of my mint, I have some apple mint that came from the other side of my garden, burrowed underground and popped up in this mess. So I have apple mint here too. I have some sage over there, but I could harvest half of this stuff, clear it out, give it some space to breathe. This would not be a very fixable issue if it was tomatoes or squash or things that I need to produce fruit. Because if I cut out half my tomatoes, that feels really bad before I got any tomatoes. So just to kind of visual representation of how your eyes can play tricks on you when you're gardening. You might think this space is so big, but it really only takes a few mature plants to take up this whole space. But that's all my slides for today. Again, if you have any more specific questions about compost or how you should think about composting at your center, you're welcome to email me. We could also schedule a Zoom meeting or something. We can meet one-on-one. I'd be happy to do that. But are there any questions in the chat that I missed, Sharonda? Thank you for calling those
There
out.
are. Not sure who has answers on what licensing allows, but can I use fish emulsion fertilizer on a playground garden?
I've used fish emulsion at childcare centers before. Fish emulsion does not stick around very long. I think it's one of the best fertilizers you can use. At least the child care center, which was the child development center in Boone that I used to work at for a few years, it was not a licensing issue there when I worked there. I don't know if that's changed. I would be very doubtful that you couldn't use that, but definitely worth checking. The nice thing about fish emulsion is that you can't put too much on there. You can't burn plants with it, which can happen with some fertilizers. And plants can absorb fish emulsion through their leaves and through the soil, which is kind of rare for a fertilizer. It also smells really bad, so it's a fun activity. Kids get a rise out of how nasty and stinky it is, but you're also showing them recycling. So I'm recycling this fish into a fertilizer, but yeah, Trish said it's never come up. It's never come up in my work, and I've used it at a few ECE gardens, but definitely worth checking out if you're worried about it.
All right. Also, curious to know how straw mulching over cover crop mulch would affect how much I need to water.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. Straw mulching is going to act completely different than cover crop mulching. So straw mulching is going to insulate my garden, so I'd have to water less. Um, if I'm putting cover crops down as a mulch, usually what that means there's no other plants there. So that could not be the case, but usually that means my whole garden area is that cover crop. So no, I'm watering the cover crop, whereas the straw doesn't obviously need water, but it's insulating the water for maybe the tomato that I've mulched it with. Yeah, but the cover crop will need water. I guess is the best way to put it. But that there's so many ways that could look at. I have to see like your specific example, I guess.
I was mostly referring to, sorry, that was me that asked that question, if it's okay. I was mostly I'm planning on using winter kill cover crops and then
Yeah.
allowing that to be the mulch in the spring.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And
Okay.
so in general, just I know mulch can help hold moisture. Would you just say that the answer is still just using a moisture meter? Or would
Yeah,
you need to
yeah,
water less or about the same?
yeah. So you're saying like you're gonna turn the cover crop into the soil and then plant new things in the spring, right?
I tend to practice no-till, but
Okay. Oh, okay.
in general, like if you cut it and then allow it to stay on the soil as a mulch to cover the soil.
Oh yeah, then that will act just like straw. I mean, it'll be slightly different, but yeah, you'll have the exact same results.
Gotcha. Thank
Yeah,
you.
And I have another one for you, Kyle. Is
yeah.
there a way to reverse overwatering when you see yellow leaves at the bottom of the plant? And is there a plant that hot composter works better for?
Okay, so in terms of like the yellowing on the leaves, that's a very minimal symptom. Plants, leaves are the easiest thing for a plant to regrow, or that's minimal damage. So that's the early signs. If I personally stop watering as much because let's say I see that and I know I've just been watering like 5 days a week and I realize, wow, that was too much. If I just pull back, give it a normal watering schedule, usually that plant will recover no problem. If it's nature doing that and then it rains the next 5 days, then I might have an issue. But that's a very minimal symptom. Usually any symptom, plants make new leaves very easily. So that's a very minimal symptom, I guess, is the best way to put it. But the other question was about hot composting and which plants like it. Is there a plant that hot composting works for better? I guess you mean when you make hot compost. I need more clarification on that question. Are you asking, is there a plant that I put in my compost pile that's better for hot composting? Or are you asking if the final product of hot compost is better for certain plants in my garden? Or what do you mean by that question? I guess I've just answered both.
Cassandra, are you able to come off and unmute yourself?
I can just answer it both ways. So plants I'm putting into my compost pile to compost, it doesn't really matter what type of plant for the hot compost, as long as I have that sort of green and brown ratio in some sort of correct way. I've seen it work from 1 to 1, green to brown. As long as I have the right ingredients, it doesn't really matter what plant I'm putting in. And then it doesn't really matter what plant I'm putting hot compost on after it's finished, because it's not hot anymore after it's finished. It's just a good soil amendment for really my garden in general. So I guess the best answer is it doesn't matter what plant I'm putting in the compost or what plant I'm putting the compost on.
My question was about the yellow leaves. You said when you overwater a plant, your leaves turn yellow on the bottom. Is there a way to reverse this process?
Yeah, like usually that's the very first sign. And if I correct that, and again, the only way you could correct that is if now you start paying really good attention to how much it rained that week, or maybe you were watering every day, you cut it back to watering 2 days a week very deeply. The plants will almost always recover if it's just those maybe bottom 2 leaves. You could, like, for most plants, you could just pinch those 2 leaves off. Usually those types of leaves aren't helping the plant, but usually they will definitely recover if that's the only symptom I'm seeing from overwatering.
Okay. And the second part of the question was is there a particular plant that using hot compost is best for?
So using the final product of compost to put on a living plant is best for, was that the question?
No, you said you have a hot compost and a cold. Is there a particular plant that hot compost is better for?
No, it's the
Just
final
preference.
product of hot compost is good for my whole garden, and any plant I'm putting in the hot compost pile to compost it is going to be fine as long as I'm sort of in that recipe ratio that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
If
The
there are
last
no
thing I'll
more,
say, oh, sorry. The last thing I'll say about composting is that be very careful about like a local compost vendor, because there's not very many regulations on what people can claim as compost. So very often, like a gardening center will say they're selling compost. But what they've really done is they've taken wood chips and they've added nitrogen fertilizer to those wood chips and made some sort of composting material. That's not what you want in your garden. You just want to be sure if you're buying compost from a local vendor, they're doing it in a way that's helping the environment and is actually a product you want in your garden. I've definitely seen lots of vendors who are selling things that aren't really compost, as compost. So just be careful about who you're buying your compost from.
Okay, well, we are at 2:15. So Kyle, want to thank you. Good conversations as always, everybody. I will send out everything on Friday again. Just make sure that we do have all of your information in the chat. And other than that, I would just like to say thank you.